All right, we will go ahead and get started. So thanks for the people that were able to join last minute. I typically try to get the word out a little bit further in advance than this, and just had a lot of stuff going on. For those of you that were on here early, I've not had a vehicle for about 2 weeks, and then I was at a gold school for the training program that the training system that I use last week, and then we're just trying to play catch up now since I basically lost a week of time being at that school. So apologies for that. Tonight, what I want to talk about is just some stuff that I found helpful over the years, as Gretchen and I have handled a number of dogs in a number of tests in a number of different venues. So I've handled dogs in like AKC, UKC obedience. I've handled dogs in NAVHDA utility tests. And then a couple of the JGHV tests that are required for our dogs to be bred through that German system. We've also trained a number of dogs that don't belong to us and helped other handlers who have participated in these tests, most of them first-time handlers. And I think there's just some stuff that when you're going through training with your NAVHDA chapter or with your breed club, some of this stuff gets missed sometimes. And then I think that our organizations think very optimistically of themselves and their judging. And in my experience, I've never really run my dog in a test that I felt completely happy with the way the judging went. So we're going to talk about stuff you can do to maybe preempt some issues there sometimes. And just like, I don't know, ways you can navigate some of those things the day of the test. We'll talk a little bit about preparation leading up to the test, training do's and don'ts as you're getting close to that time where you're going to be running your dog in one of those tests. Let's see, what else do we have here? And then for specific exercises, I'll just talk about pieces that I see as like common points of failure. And sometimes these are just handler things that we don't know to address when we're at the test, and then it can cause pretty big problems for the dogs. So the first thing that I want to talk about is if you are entering your dog in any test, you should be reading your rule book. So if you are participating in NAVHDA tests, they have a book called the Aims and Rules book. It's published right on the website, so you can download it. It's not hard to find. They also run Aims and Rules clinics where you can go and learn from judges about how those tests are judged. For the German club, the JGHV, there is a book called the VZPO, and there's another one called the VGPO. The VZPO has the VJP and HCP in it, and then the VGPO is the book that covers the rules for the VGP test. And so knowing exactly what your rubric is for how you're being judged in those tests is going to be really, really important to you being successful. In particular, you want to look at places. I'll use the JGHV book as an example. There are places where it says must, the dog must do something, and there's places where it says the dog shall do things. And where it says the dog must do something, that's kind of pass fail, right? So your dog does it, you're good. If the dog doesn't do it, you're out of the test. And then for dog shall, when they say the dog shall do something, that means that you are being graded on that scale of however many points. It's up to 11 or 12 in extenuating circumstances for the puppy test and the HCP, and then it's on a 4-point scale for VGP. In NAVHDA, right, we use a 4-point scale there, and then there's multipliers for different things. So when you look at that rule book, you know what are your pass-fail things. Like for a lot of these tests, if your dog does not complete a retrieve, then you fail. And then there is a little bit of subjectivity about what a completed retrieve is. So you can look at that information. If my dog comes to me and drops it within 10 feet of me, does that count? If I have to take a step to reach towards them to take the bird, does that count as retrieve to hand? Does my dog have to sit when they present, or can they stand? Does the positioning matter? Any of those sorts of things that will be outlined in your rule book. So you should look at those things. So in addition to the pass fail stuff and knowing the things where you're graded kind of, on the point scale, you also want to look at where you can give up points pretty safely. So an example of this a lot of times is the retrieving work. Again, using JGHV, for example, in the test for the German dogs, they must sit when they present game to the handler. Well, if they don't sit and you just take that item from the dog, it will drop you a couple points, but you're still in the game. So if instead I let my dog walk past me with game, dance around, go say hi to the judge, right, or they're going to drop it, then those are all things that are going to impact my score far more than if I were to just snatch that thing out of the dog's mouth, assuming I didn't have to take more than a step or so. And I think you'll find the same thing in NAVHDA too. You will be graded less harshly if you are just taking items from the dog's mouth as soon as they get near you than you would if you let them dance around and create a bunch of problems, right? Because then you're getting knocked in your cooperation score, you're getting knocked in your obedience score, you're probably still getting knocked in your retrieve score. So instead of getting dinged in 3 categories, just take that item from the dog and you'll only get dinged in your retrieve, right? So when you're looking at these exercises and looking at your rubric in your rule book, that's going to tell you how you're graded, and it's going to tell you the places where you can lose points and still be all right. The other thing it's going to tell you is what your multipliers are for different exercises. So utility test in NAVHDA, for instance, healing is worth 4 points. So out of 204 points, 4 points are for your healing, I believe. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend a ton of time on healing, but it does make a lot of sense to spend enough time on healing that you at least get the score you need to be able to get a prize 1. I have been at tests where dogs smoked the rest of the test and their healing was terrible. And that was the reason that a handler missed out on a prize 1. They missed out on being able to go to the invitational because they didn't teach some basic obedience, right? So you have to know these things and know how that stuff works. The other thing that you'll see in these books, like the Aims and Rules book or the VZPO, is details about how these test exercises are supposed to be set up. So I'll give an example of a test that I was in where the test was set up in a way that wasn't in accordance with the rule book. So at one of the utility tests that I ran one of my dogs in for NAVHDA, in the Aims and Rules book, I believe it says 50 to 70 yards is where they're going to stick a duck as long as there's cover for your duck search, 50 to 70 yards away from shore. So the duck for our test was taken out by kayak, past a bunch of cover. Where it was actually dropped, we measured it on Onyx after the fact. It was about 130 yards away. And so in the NAVHDA test, the duck search, the duck is set downwind from the dog. So the dog isn't really supposed to be able to smell it or have any sort of track or indication that there's even a duck there necessarily, right? So you're just supposed to shoot and then send the dog, and then the dog's supposed to do an expanding search, right? We equate that to drive, the dog's willingness to stay out there and continue expanding their search. And so, I think maybe in that setup, people maybe thought they were doing you a favor a little bit, where they set something out that far. Then as long as my dog's doing a nice big search, then I'm not going to have to do a resend, right? And then if my dog doesn't counter the duck, then that creates some potential issues for obedience, getting the dog back out of the water. Do we have to shoot the duck? All sorts of other stuff like that. The difficulty for me is I work my dogs in both training systems, both testing systems, the German testing system and NAVHDA. And so the German duck search exercise, the duck is dropped about 30 to 50 meters into the water, and then it's allowed to swim away. It creates a track. And so what they really want to see is that you can send your dog to that spot where that duck fell, and then your dog will track that duck on the water. So the way that exercise is evaluated in each organization is a little bit different. And because my dogs have to test in the German system in order to be bred, it's part of our breed club requirements, then I train duck search for that, and I enter my NAVHDA test and hope that it goes well. I'll try to stylize it a little bit with slightly different training if I can. But in that situation, the duck being set so far away, there not being any set on the water. And then the last thing was the helpers set the ducks behind us and the wind was at our back. So the only scent that my dogs had to go off of was scent of ducks in a box behind me. And so they did tighter duck searches than they typically do, because the only scent that they had, and I always have scent involved because of the way the German duck search is run, They kind of hold up tight, and so they didn't get as good a scores as they should have. So in that test, my Dratar Anya got a 200 prize 2. She got a 3 in duck search, so we missed out because of 1 point on one exercise, and that was because of 2 things, really. The test exercise really wasn't set up the way that it should have been according to the aims and rules. But second, that's a thing that you as a handler need to be aware that those things can happen, and you need to proof your dog off of that stuff. There's going to be those sorts of things happen. And so you can bet that for the whole next training season, until I ran that test again, we always had ducks all over the shore or in a kayak that was sitting right there by the edge of the water, right? We had those things there as distractions to help the dog understand it. It's not these ones. It's not this here. You got to get out away from me and you got to go work, right? So our dogs are pretty good at duck searches. I kind of take a lot of pride in the fact that I think we're good at training those things, but there's some stylization stuff, a little bit of proofing that I missed. And then I think test exercise could have been set up better too, right? So your test booklet will tell you how these things are supposed to be organized. And then before you start your exercise with your dog, you can usually ask or watch these things being set up. And then what would have been helpful is if I asked the question, like, hey, that is not set out there the way that the aims and rules book says. So it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to change anything, but I could at least bring it up to them and question it beforehand. You're allowed to ask as many of those kinds of questions as you'd like. Quiet. We have 2 puppies in the living room that are upset and I think probably a little hungry. So you can ask those kinds of questions. It may or may not make a difference in terms of the setup, but I would at least ask, right? Then it's in the judge's head, it's noted, right? And then you can kind of articulate why you're saying that thing. In other situations, I've seen, hold on one second, admit. In other situations, I have seen just a number of other things that weren't really kind of set up quite right. We'll talk about those a little bit later in this, that they weren't anything that I think was, you know, not in line with the rule book, but they're things that maybe weren't in line with setting the exercise up to really see what they intended to see from the dogs, right? So we'll talk about those things a little bit later. So that's the rule book stuff. You got to read the rules. You got to know the standard by which you're being judged. Quiet. Thank you, Gretchen. So the next thing we're going to talk about is your training leading up to the test. When I'm talking about this, I'm talking about the last month before you are going to be actually running your dog in the test. Some of this is true all of the time, but some of it is specific to that time period. So the first thing is, in these tests that we run, something that's a little different about the NAVHDA and JGHV tests compared to a lot of other dog sports is we don't really have test exercises where our dogs have to do work and then they don't get reinforced on the field. What I mean by that is if I go to an AKC obedience trial, for instance, my dog has to do a whole routine and they don't really get any positive reinforcement or rewards while they're working. I can maybe reward them as soon as we leave the ring. Maybe in between exercises, I can tell them they did a good job and pet them a little bit. But as far as using like toys or food as rewards, you're not able to do that when you're in the ring. With all of our work with these hunting dogs, each exercise does lead to them ending up with game in their mouth most of the time, right? So if I do my field work correctly, then birds are getting shot and I'm getting to go pick them up. If I do my duck search correctly, I have a duck in my mouth, or at least I believe very deeply in my heart that I will have one. And maybe my test day is the only day that that doesn't actually happen for me. You know, for the dragged game tracks, same thing. They get to actually possess that item in the process of returning it to you. And so my point is that there is no exercise that you do on that test where they don't get what they want. The one exception you maybe could argue is the healing leading up to the study by the blind sequence in the utility test. And then in the German test, there are a couple just pure obedience exercises. But for the most part, most things your dog gets to get some kind of reward. And so one of the really critical things in training is to make sure that your dog is not able to reward themselves for being disobedient or doing the work incorrectly. So I see this a lot on dragged game tracks. People run their dogs without a leash on a bunch, and then their dog breaks into a field search instead of tracking to find game. Even in a testing system like NAVHDA where that's allowed, they don't care how the dog finds the game. They just care that they find it, pick it up, and bring it back to the handler. It would be better if your dog tracks, because if your dog gets on too big of a field search, then they get too far away from that game and maybe they don't recover it. And so if we can kind of make a point to not allow the dog to break into field search by working that exercise on lead a little bit, or having the helper pick that game up. So once they break into field search, there is no possibility for completing that exercise correctly. Those sorts of things can be really helpful. Same thing, I just was at a training day only for people that are testing for a local chapter here. And they were working on Steady by the Blind. And I watched a number of handlers correct their dog repeatedly for trying to enter the water too soon. And then at the very end of that, they unhooked their leash. And then before they actually gave the cue for the dog to retrieve, the dog broke and then was able to go complete the retrieve. And every one of those handlers kind of just threw their hands up in the air and said like, oh, well, what are you going to do? Well, the answer is you don't unclip your leash until you're actually about to send your dog. So I have my finger on that bolt snap at the same time that I'm about to tap my dog on the head or tell them to fetch. I've proofed them, like I flick that bolt snap on my leash a bunch and let them know that just because that thing comes off doesn't mean that they're able to go leave. So I'll click that thing and then they try to break and I just hang on to that line and stop them until that stops happening, right? But I proof for those things and we make sure that they don't get to go get rewarded for being disobedient. Another one is breaking in the field. People seem to have an allergy to check cords. We like to use e-collars a lot, but I will, leading up to the test, have my dog drag a check cord at least once or twice in the field so that I can just have somebody step on that thing if we need to, so I can make sure that they can't go complete a retrieve before I send them. And so we're just trying to make sure that leading up to the test, we're not allowing the dog to reward themselves for incorrect behaviors or for disobedience. The next thing is I should really be questioning whether or not I should be running my dog in a test if I'm not having clean runs in training for at least a couple training sessions in a row. What I mean by clean runs is all of your equipment is on your dog. So if you run your dog with an e-collar on, that's on. If you run them with a check cord or a little tab leash attached to their collar, then you keep all of that stuff on them and you run them through all of their test exercises, maybe not all in one day, but you're running through all of those things and you're not having to use your equipment, right? What I see a lot of people do is they say, you know, it's a week or two before the test. I can't use the equipment on the test, so I'm going to take the equipment off now and see what happens. Well, all you're doing there is giving your dog an opportunity to do the wrong thing and get away with it. And so, again, especially in training scenarios where there is a reward built into the work the dog is doing, I don't think that we need to worry about these kind of equipment shedding protocols that you see in a lot of other like testing environments. So you'll see this a lot in people that do the protection sports. So like French ring, Mondio ring, PSA, all those sorts of things. A lot of those folks, IGP, a lot of those folks will have an equipment shedding process. They're playing with their dog in the parking lot and they're gradually taking equipment off the dog in a way where, to me, it kind of feels like they're trying to trick the dog into thinking that they still have equipment on. And I think that some of that is required because they have elements of their work where their dog has really compelling distractions, basically rewards just out there on the field that they're not allowed to have. And so the thing that's keeping them from just taking those things is the tools. And so we try to have the dog believe that the tools are still on. Again, in our testing venues, most of our test exercises end with the dog getting a reward. So my job is in training to just make sure that I am preventing access to them getting those things by doing stuff incorrectly. And so I kind of already touched on this, but the next bullet point I have is that we need to keep equipment on our dogs. I don't think it's a good idea for you to see how it goes. I know a lot of people do that. I know some people are successful. I think it's generally a bad idea for people to do that. When I'm working on these exercises, the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to give somebody else my equipment. So I'm going to have somebody else hanging on to my check cord if needed. I'm going to have somebody else that I trust with my e-collar remote so that I can handle my dog the way I would handle my dog on the test. I don't have extra things in my hands that cue the dog to the fact that they can be corrected. And I'm able to practice the things that I need to work on, like how I'm going to handle game when it's retrieved to me by my dog. When I'm allowed to pass a gun off to a judge, like practicing those handoffs and how that stuff's going to go. I get to practice all that stuff instead of fumbling with my equipment. So if you have training partners that you work with on a regular basis, give them your tools so that you can handle the way that you would handle on the test. I think that's what most people intend to do when they take equipment off, but you can practice your part while still allowing your dog to have accountability when you're working on those things. Does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff that we talked about so far? All right, if you do have questions as we go through this, there is a chat option down in the bottom right if you're on a desktop. I don't know where it is if you're on your phone, but you can type questions in there and I'll answer them at the end. The next thing that I want to talk about is I like to work on little components prior to my test. So this is probably 2 weeks out from the test. My dog should already be largely doing a lot of these test exercises correctly. So what I'm going to particularly focus on are the obedience components of these exercises. So we talked about dragged game retrieves earlier. When I am doing drags like the week or two before the test, I'm probably going to run them on a check cord. So I'm going to have my dog actually going down the track with me holding onto the check cord. I'm going to follow them. I'm letting them pull against the flat collar while they do that. When they find the game, then they're going to pick it up. And a lot of times I will have them sit there and then I will move away and have them retrieve. And I'll do shorter retrieves than the actual length of the retrieve that they have to do for the test. I'm trying to create a situation where they must be obedient, but also there's a very high chance for success. So I don't want to be beating my dog up with my tools really close to when I'm planning on testing them. And so I like to see these kind of shorter retrieves. Another way I might do this is I have them pick that object up and then we kind of backtrack on the track. So I'll walk them on leash most of the way back and then I'll have them stop. I'll sit them or whoa them and then have them complete the rest of the retrieve. Again, the goal here is I need them to know that they must do the work, but I'm also trying to set up a high success version of that exercise so that they can feel good about what they're doing, the fact that they're doing it correctly. I'm going to work a lot on my sends and resends into water for my duck search. We don't really have a resend in the JGHV test for duck search. But in NAVHDA, if your dog comes back early or if your dog gets a duck quickly, then they're going to ask to see a resend. They want to see that your dog will enter the water again. And so I see a lot of people that their dogs do really good duck searches, but they do that after they were told fetch, and then they stand on the bank or they run back and forth on the bank for 5 minutes first. And so you're not going to get a good score if your dog does that. So when we are working on our training, we do our force fetch process, right? Then we do force to pile, which is I'm going to send you repeatedly to go get stuff. So that's basically practicing resends. And then so we're practicing resends there. And then we do that work, force to pile work, and then we move that into the water, pile of bumpers or a handful of dead ducks out in the water. And I'm going to send my dog repeatedly. I'm using my electronics each time. I'm helping them understand when I tell you to fetch or I tell you back or whatever my cue is, you have to get in the water and you have to move away from me. So in those cases, I am using my tools to apply pressure to the dog. Once they're in the water and swimming, I let go of my e-collar pressure, and then the bumpers or the ducks for them at that point are very obvious. They're easy to see. They're not super far away. I'm just trying to make sure they understand when I tell you get in the water, get your ass in the water. The last thing is enforcing the return on retrieves. So again, this is maybe 2 weeks out. A month to 2 weeks out from my test, I'm going to really start hammering really clean deliveries. I don't ever use super high level corrections with e-collars with my dogs, but I do use meaningful amounts of pressure, so enough that they want to turn it off. And I am trying to make sure that it only turns off when they do the right thing. What I see a lot of people do with recalls on retrieve, so the dog's supposed to come to me, sit or stand near me, and deliver that object to hand. If your dog is stopping short and you're having to usually move to them to grab objects, you're creating a pattern that is going to show up in your test. So what I always do is I make a point to walk away from my dogs, stim them with e-collar a little bit, tell them to come to me, So I'm just helping them understand, like, you got to come all the way to me and basically touch me with that bird. That way there isn't this idea that they get hung up. And I do this with e-collar instead of with hands-on corrections, like, a prong collar or a pinch collar or something like that, or even me getting handsy with my dog in any way, because I want those corrections to be impersonal. I went to a Dratar training day one time as these guys were preparing for their tests, and I watched pretty much every dog out of a group of 10 guys. All those dogs did beautiful drag game retrieves, and then when they got within 10 yards of their handlers, they just stopped. And the reason why they stopped is because every one of those guys got really rough with them and beat them up for whatever they were doing for that last 10 yards regularly enough that the dog's logic, right? The dog goes, if I don't get near you, then you can't be mean to me, right? So if we use e-collar, one of the benefits of e-collar is it can be impersonal. So I can just say, you're going to be itchy or mildly uncomfortable until you complete this action and get all the way to me, right? So just thinking about those things as you're leading up to the test can be really, really helpful. So that's the most that we're going to talk about training on this webinar. But those are things that kind of in that last month to 2 months, those are the things that I'm really kind of cleaning up. I'm going to do full exercises once in a while, but what I'm really doing, I should kind of have already gotten that done. And I'm just picking on the little components that I might need to tighten up, or the ones that I know are the ones that I'll fail if they don't happen. Right. So like retrieves are big. And then, just the general obedience work there. When you get to that 1 to 2 weeks out from the test, for me, training is over. Right. So you're not going to fix problems in that short of a period of time. At that point, whatever you have from your dog is what you have in the test. Likely, if you're feeling a lot of pressure, you're going to put a lot of pressure on your dog in any training that you would do in those last 2 weeks. So I don't really do much field work. I'm really not setting up these test exercises that close to my test. I have broken that rule on 1 or 2 occasions. It never really, I think, made a big difference in how stuff turned out. So my general suggestion is that you don't do that. The week of the test, what I will do is enforce all of my obedience around the house. But I am also going to try to play with my dog and give them a lot of time to kind of get loose and relax. So stopping at doorways, heeling when we're walking through the neighborhood, right? Recalls, making sure that they have to come back to me when I'm calling them out of the backyard, or if I'm running them at the local park or golf course or something like that. I'm enforcing all of those basic obedience exercises. We are away from field work contexts though, right? So I'm not in a field environment. I'm not doing this stuff in test exercise setups. I'm doing this just in my day-to-day life to just kind of maintain some consistency there. And again, I'm trying to balance that out with them having a decent amount of time to kind of just relax. Depending on your dog, the day of the test, different people have different opinions. I think if you tend to have maybe a more sensitive dog or a dog that isn't as high drive, I might not do much with them the week of the test, or at least a couple days before the test. And I'm certainly not going to do anything with them the day of the test. I want them to kind of bottle up a lot of that energy, and then I want to see that come out. Maybe want to see them be a little edgier than they usually are if they're on the lower end of the drive scale, assuming I have my control elements in place. If I have a really high drive dog, then sometimes it's a good idea to pre-exhaust them a little bit before your test. So if you can get there early, you can take them for a nice run for 20 minutes, half an hour, something like that. And you'll know your dogs. Then sometimes that can just take a little bit of an edge off for them. And then we can see that kind of helps them get through the test with a little bit more of a clear head. So I have one of each of those dogs. And so my handling of each of them is a little bit different as we enter a test, because they have different temperaments. And so whenever somebody gives you always or never advice, I would usually caution you to be skeptical of that, right? Usually when people give you that advice, they are used to having a certain kind of dog that fits their type of training. And so, you should adjust this stuff to your individual dogs. When we are at our test, I think it's always a good idea. Usually have like a handlers meeting at the beginning of the day where they walk through the order of the test exercises. They kind of talk through things. I think that's a good time to just verify that test exercises are set up as they are supposed to be in the rule book. So in hindsight, this duck search issue that I talked to you about, at any test moving forward, I'm going to say, so in that test exercise, you're going to set that duck, you know, between this distance and this distance away, and it's going to be upwind or downwind. Like, I'm going to ask clarifying questions, and I want them to answer, because then when I get out to the water, if it's not set up that way, we can have a conversation there. And I've already kind of cornered them into an answer that I want, right? That they're going to agree with the test booklet beforehand, and then when they actually get there, sometimes you see they set stuff up a little wonky. If I already have them on the hook with an answer earlier on, I think sometimes that has some influence and sway if I start questioning something right before a test exercise. The next thing you can do is have a friend or a training partner watch other people who are going before you, and they can tell you where dogs are having trouble. Chip Bondi, who's a member of our NAVHDA chapter, Potomac NAVHDA chapter, he talks about one of the recent invitationals where the way they set the exercise up, there was like 2 points, I think, on either side of the line the dog was supposed to take to go across the water. And so a lot of dogs had trouble, and they would go over to a point, and they thought they had completed the blind retrieve portion of that, because most NAVHDA folks just teach their dog to line. They don't really teach true blind retrieving, like casting and directionals and all that stuff. And so these dogs were hitting that point thinking that they did that blind correctly, and then they broke into a duck search because there was no duck there. And so there was a high failure rate there. I think it was over 50%. Somebody ran the numbers for that particular time when that happened. And so for me, if I knew that, because I had somebody that could have watched a number of dogs at that water, and they could have told me that that was going to happen, and that because of the wind, maybe the dogs were favoring a certain side, perhaps I line my dog the opposite direction. Maybe that puts them, you know, into better wind. Maybe that just keeps them away from that sticking point that a lot of other dogs can have. And so you can have somebody who's watching that stuff tell you those things, and you can make handling adjustments if you've done the training for those things ahead of time. So in that case, if I'm talking about lining, I need to know that I've worked on drills that say, if there's something here for you and here for you, can I use heeling to point you at this one or point you at that one? If I haven't taught that skill, then it's not going to be useful to me. If I've taught my dog casting and directionals, then maybe when they get on that point, I know that I can whistle them and they'll stop and turn around and look at me, and then I can give them a cast that will send them back to where they should have been in the first place. And so in those situations, if I have those skills, if I worked on them in advance, then I can have a helper tell me these are the places where dogs are getting hung up. And then I've already installed the antibiotics to that sickness through my training that I did before. Right. And so that's the goal of these things, and why, like, when I've done all of these webinars beforehand, a lot of the training that I do, a lot of people would say, like, you're doing too much. Your dog doesn't need to have all those skills. I'm trying to make sure that if my dog gets in trouble on the day of the test, that I can handle them to success. This is a line, Pat Nolan. He's a really, really brilliant retriever trainer, and now he trains a lot of dogs for like military and government contract work. He says in training, you handle your dog to show them the approved route. And what he means is, I'm going to show you exactly the right way to do this. I'm going to use all of my tools and my cues and my rewards, my pressure, everything that I have. I'm going to use that to show you, you do it exactly like this. And then the day of the test, your job is to handle your dog to avoid failing. And those are not the same thing, right? But I have to have installed those skills in training to be able to use them during the test, to be able to handle my dog better. Okay, so having a friend watch that stuff and come back and give you some tips, I think that's very helpful. So again, on that one duck search that I felt like was set up a little wonky, the box of ducks was set behind us. So the only duck scent my dog smelled was basically coming from me. And so after that happened, I said something about it. So this was reactive instead of proactive, right? So it doesn't do me any good, but they moved those birds for the rest of the dogs that ran in that test. And so because of that, the people afterwards had, they didn't have that issue to contend with. And so if you had somebody who could see that, would know that that would be a problem because they can feel the wind, they can see the setup, and they're able to kind of read that play, then they can come back and tell you. And then when you walk up, you can say, hey, can you guys move that? Right? Or you might not even have to talk to the judges about that. A lot of us, we do these tests at our own chapters. If I'm able to peek around the corner and see that those ducks are set there and that they're basically blowing scent straight to where the handler is supposed to launch their dog, I might tell somebody like, hey, radio to that guy and tell him to move that box of ducks, right? Because that wasn't even necessarily a thing that the judges were thinking about. That was a helper that kind of maybe didn't know better than to not set that up that way, but it caused a major problem for that test, right? So you definitely should ask questions about your score if there's anything that you don't like. So in both organizations, JGHV and NAVHDA, they do allow a protest period. I'm not even necessarily saying you're protesting your score. I am saying that you're asking questions about it. So if you feel like something went a certain way and then it, you know, the score you got doesn't really match up, or you feel like something about the setup was a little wonky, I think it's good to just have those conversations with these folks, because nobody's perfect, and you know, they're usually coming into grounds they're not familiar with when they're setting all these things up and making decisions about where they're gonna, you know, where they're gonna run different test exercises. But if you can have those conversations with them, then they think about that, and I think that it's a very casual, like not pushy way of maybe giving them some feedback about how stuff could get set up better in the future. I think that tends to go over a lot better than saying like, hey, you guys really messed this up. Then I think you just become that guy that local judges know is kind of a pain in the ass. And so it's probably not ideal to kind of approach things that way. As a general rule, I think that like judges tend to do a good job, but they do make mistakes. And I think that what I hear in both testing venues, the judges say at the beginning of every test is, you know, we're here to see the best in your dog. But then what I really, honestly, if I'm being honest with you, what I see is certain test exercises being set up in a way that's convenient for the judging team. So whether it's a short walk or it's just close to some other thing that we need to do. I've seen a number of times where I just felt like you watch dogs not do well because of a setup issue, and then like no adjustments got made. So the most glaring recent example was at an NA test in the puppy water. They were trying to throw bumpers to get the dogs to swim, but the water had a current. It was a little creek, and so it was pushing the bumpers straight back to where the puppies were. So the puppies just stick their toes in the water a little bit. They pick a bumper up. Once they've done that one time, they know they're all going to come back that way, and then they don't have to go in the water. So I don't understand personally why after you see that happen with one dog one time, you don't immediately move somewhere else to do that exercise, but they didn't. They ran every dog that way, and every dog failed the water, except I think one. And so you had a bunch of dogs that I think failed that test because the test exercise was set up in a way that was convenient for the judging team, but not really appropriate for the dogs under judgment. And so you can say stuff about that stuff, and you should. You know, I think you have to be tactful in how you do that. But you see that kind of stuff happen all the time. And that's what I mean when I say, like, I've never been to a test where I felt like everything was just done well. You know, there's just always been one thing where I'm like, it's really a shame that got set up that way. Some other things at the test for specific activities where I see potentially high rates of failure for any of the tracking exercises. So those are for drags. This is for the pheasant track for the NA puppy test. This is for the live rabbit track for the VJP test. You should have enough obedience on your dog, even though all of those are things that are happening at puppy tests, that your dog isn't dragging you to the start of those exercises. And the reason for that is because if they're pulling against their equipment, then they're usually expending an awful lot of energy that way. And then when you think about those tracking exercises, hang on one second. When you think about those tracking exercises, when my dog is tracking, I need to be able to have them work mouth closed, right? I want to hear them breathing through their nose so they're smelling. And if my dog tanks just on the walk up to the staging area for me to run that track, then when they go to track, they're breathing like this. And when that happens, they're not using their nose, at least not anywhere near as well as they could. And so depending on how the test is set up, you have more or less time to deal with this. Like in a lot of the JGHV tests, the puppy test for VJP, you are walking behind people who are beating bushes trying to flush rabbits so that you can put your dog on a track. And so in those situations, you may be walking your dog around for an hour or more before you actually do a track, depending on how hard it is for them to flush bunnies for you. And so in those situations, it's really important that your dog has a reasonably decent ability to walk by your side. I believe they allow you to use slip leads, right? So I can use something that at least does some pressure and release. It's not just a flat collar that the dog can lean against. Well, I'm sorry, what's that, Gretch? Okay, Gretchen's telling me that you're not allowed to use slip leads in the JGHV test. I know 100% for sure. I have seen people do it. So again, this is a rule book thing that you might need to check. But I'm certain I've seen people use slip leads when they're walking their dog for those parts. But so when you are walking your dog there, you kind of got to try to get them, even if they are pulling you a bunch, when you get to a stopping point because another dog's running a track, then take that time to give them some water, make them lay down. All right, the ground hopefully is a little bit cooler, put them in the shade, just do things to help keep them cool so they're not panting as much. That way they can use their nose better. It's just really, really, really important. I see a lot of dogs have trouble there. They gas before they've even started their exercise. And then for that, for both of these systems, right? Like in NAVHDA, you have the option to show your dog a pheasant first. That tends to put the dog in a really high drive state, get them way overexcited. And for young dogs that aren't really good at self-control yet anyway, probably not a great idea. So I would not show them a pheasant, and I would not let them watch another dog do that tracking exercise. For the VJP test, since you are walking kind of like with a group of handlers behind the brush beaters, your dog is likely going to see rabbits flush. And then your dog won't be put on those tracks, but they'll see that happen, and they will see other dogs potentially getting released to complete tracks. My suggestion for you, again, if you have obedience and a little bit of healing, is I heal my dog and have them turn around and face away from all of that stuff that's happening, right? If I don't have that, I might make a point to kind of cover my dog's eyes. What I'm trying to do is take away all of the things that are going to increase the dog's arousal and make them start kind of fighting me there, which again just leads to them tanking before they even start their exercise. And if they're breathing through their mouth, then they're not using their nose as well as they could. The next thing I want to mention is we do have a number of obedience-based, or what we call capping exercises. When I say capping, I mean drive capping. And so what this means is the dog knows that they're going to get to do something exciting. They're going to get to do something where they're expressing prey drive, but they have to kind of keep a lid on it. That's why it's called capping. They have to kind of hold on to it for a little bit before they're able to do that. So before I send my dog for a duck search, right, in NAVHDA, I'm shooting a shot, right? And for a lot of us, that shot gets the dog really excited and kind of looking out for what they're supposed to do, but they can't break then. They need to wait for you to send them. And so that's one example. All of our field work, so like utility test level work, if my dog is pointing and then gunners are walking in front, we're flushing the bird, they're shooting the bird, and that dog needs to be steady through wing shot and fall. That's all capping. The dog was engaged in hunting behavior. That was prey-driven behavior. They point, that is elicited instinctive behavior. And then everything after that is obedience and capping. It's them being able to keep their shit together instead of losing their mind and then kind of breaking and doing things that we consider disobedient and unmannerly on birds. And so the two suggestions that I have for these things are, the first one is the easiest thing to do. You break up patterns. So if I'm going to work on steady by the blind, and I know when I do that, then I'm putting my dog in a stay behind the blind. I walk out of sight. I shoot 2 shots. Then I return to my dog. I heel them outside of the blind. And then there are 4 shots before the dog gets to go complete a marked retrieve. So it goes shot, 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 bird gets flown, and then I shoot, and then the dog gets sent. Your dog can count. So if there's 2 shots out when you're out of sight before you return, you should always do more than 2 shots. That way your dog is expecting to stay longer than they will actually stay on the test. If you are working on that next part with the marked retrieve, there are 4 shots. We always do more than that. So we can do shot, 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 bird launches, right? Because all that's going to be the same, and I need my dog to understand that. But then maybe I shoot a couple times, right, before I send my dog. Maybe I make a point to call my dog back to heel often and then send them. There's just different things I can do. I just want to break that pattern up. I don't ever want it to be the pattern that it was on the test. I always want it to be longer than that if I can help it, because then my dog just has as their expectation that they're going to have to wait longer. That works well as long as you know your dog's actually going to do what you tell them to do when you tell them to do it. And if you don't have that, that's a training issue, and that's outside of the scope of what we're talking about tonight, right? But if I tell you to fetch, you should fetch. And if I haven't given you that command yet, you shouldn't go. But a lot of that is breaking up the pattern of anticipation that your dog has. Another way that you can do this is to add pauses intentionally when you're practicing this stuff in training, and then removing those pauses in the actual test. So there's a guy that's very famous in the bite sport world. His name's Helmut Reiser. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but there was a guy named Pat Stewart. He's a guy I recommend you all follow on social media. He was just talking about this today. He calls it the white finger. So basically, there's a bunch of exercises where there's a sequence of events, and the handler touches the dog with their hand, just as like I'm adding another step in this sequence of events that breaks up the real sequence of events that would happen in the test. And so what my dog is expecting to happen is there's some exercise that occurs, and then I touch them, and then that predicts the next component of the exercise, and then I touch them, and then that predicts the next component of the exercise. And so they're waiting for those touches as kind of another part of the sequence of events that's happening. And again, because dogs really start anticipating once they pick up on patterns, I want them anticipating that there's this signal that means like you're still supposed to do this, right? And that's what we're touching them, like just stay in what you're doing. And that is where we can remove them when we're actually at the test. So I'm not incorporating those like pauses or those little extra behaviors that I've kind of built as a ritual. And that is a way for me to break up my dog's anticipation. So I find that that's a really those two things are really helpful, and both of them really, it's the same takeaway is you need to break up those patterns, and you need to make these things be longer in training than they are in your test. The last thing that I'll talk about is retrieves. We already touched on a bunch of this stuff, but when in doubt, take that thing from your dog. So if you're not sure if your dog is going to present nicely, then I would make a point to just grab that bird out of your dog's mouth before they're able to do something inappropriate with it. Maybe a good rule of thumb is the first retrieve, you're going to see how it goes. So if your dog comes back and then they kind of do a little bit of parading, then every other bird for the rest of the test, I'm just going to take it from them, because I can't correct them in that moment. And so if I wait and I correct them back by the truck or something like that, it's not going to make any sense to them. It's too far after the scenario has been completed. So, you know, if I see anything I don't like about their manner of delivery on the retrieves, I'm maybe going to just see how the first one goes. But after that, I'm going to try to conserve as many points as I can. Again, you'll get knocked on your retrieve if you take that object from the dog. Check your rule books. Don't just take my word for this, right? But you'll get knocked on your retrieve for just taking the item from the dog. But you won't get knocked in a lot of other places that you could if your dog does a bunch of other goofy stuff that they're not supposed to do. And then the last thing is that lining is really important on blind retrieves. I've seen a lot of dogs in the HCP level test for the Drahtars and Munsterlanders and the other German, tested dogs. And this happens a lot for the work in the NAVHDA, even utility test. This can come up because there's situations where the marked retrieve is happening and it's not really marked for the dog because they didn't actually see it hit the water. So lining is really important. So I make a point to teach my dog when I tell them fetch, I want them to go in a straight line in the water until they either encounter the duck or they encounter scent that they can then follow and be obedient to until they encounter a duck. I've seen there's a local testing grounds that's used here in Pennsylvania for NAVHDA tests where the marked retrieve is done in kind of flooded timber. It's not there's not a lot of vegetation in the water, but there's a lot of trees that kind of get in the way of the dog being able to see that really clear arc of that bird coming from the winger and landing in the water. And so if your dog happens to just not be looking, somebody makes a noise, they cough, a bird flies by, whatever happens, they're not looking when that thing hits the water, you still need to be able to have them complete that exercise. And so being able to use heeling to line my dog up, right? So again, my dog's at my side in heel position, and if I turn a little bit, they should turn with me. If I turn the other way a little bit, they should turn with me. What I'm trying to make sure is nose, spine, tail are all in a straight line. If your dog is turning their head, but the rest of their body is pointed in the direction that you want, they're going to go where their head's pointing, right? So we need to make a point to teach them to look out straight ahead and then to go and take that line. That's helpful in the blind retrieves for sure, but also in your duck search, and then also in marked retrieving. I think that's a skill that's really important. You can teach that a lot of ways. If you kind of restrain your dog and you set out their favorite toy, you can wait until they're staring at their toy, and then you can release them to grab it. And then when they do that very reliably, you can ask them to look at you and then look back at the toy, right? So we can do a little bit of targeting that way. Easier way for me, I have the equipment already. We have this thing called a treat and train or manners minder. It's, you dump dog kibble in it and you hit a button and it spits dog food out. And so what I'll do with this is I'll let my dog watch me pour food inside of that. I close the lid on it. I set it out away from us. And then my dog is staring at it. And when they stare at it, I hit the button. It makes the machine beep. That's a reward marker that releases the dog from heel position, and they get to go grab their food. And so then when they're standing in heel position, they're looking at me. And what I teach them is when I drop my hand next to the side of your face, that means look out in front of you. Something is going to be there for you. And so we practice that a lot so that when I'm in these retrieving exercises, I can drop my hand, and that makes them take their attention off of the handler and put it out in a direction ahead of them. They're sort of picking out a landmark, and then they go to retrieve. So these are, like, I think pretty key places where I see a lot of people have trouble. High failure rate, especially when you get to the utility level tests, is just those obedience components and kind of teaching these little things there, right? So I promised in my little advertisement for today, I was going to talk about what one of my training mentors, Bart Bellin, he calls professional cheating. And this is kind of knowing and understanding the rules and then using them in your favor, right? So a couple of these things, like taking birds from dogs as a retrieve, I think that's kind of one of those things, right? If you know how you're going to get scored for those retrieves, that can really help. The big one for me is the steady by the blind sequence. A lot of dogs have trouble and they kind of come unglued there. Some training chapters, they're not going to allow you to do some of the stuff that I'm talking about where they really change up those exercises. You go to some NAVHDA chapters and they say, you get 10 minutes for duck search and we're just running the steady by the blind, no alterations to it in any way. And so if you have that kind of chapter that you're working in, then another way you can buy yourself a little bit of time or leeway in that steady by the blind sequence is put your dog in a down stay instead of putting them in a sit stay or a whoa. And the reason for this is because the rules say that your dog is not allowed to break from that position. But if your dog goes from a down to a sit and then to a stand, but they did not enter the water, then you're good. You get full points in that exercise. And so I have my dogs lay down, and pretty much every time that first shot goes off and they sit up, right? And so or what'll happen is they sit up and then they see that bird gets launched and lands in the water, then maybe that puts them in a stand. But by putting them in this stationary behavior that is the furthest they could get from the position they'll be in when they're actually in motion, I feel like you usually get these kind of steps that lead up to actually having a problem. We use this in pet dog training all the time. Like I put retrieves on dogs that bite people, and I do that so that when I'm taking them somewhere where something uncomfortable is going to happen, grooming, vet visits, things like that, if they drop that item that's in their mouth, then that's my early warning sign that we're going to have trouble. If I have a dog that resource guards in a house with people, then I'm usually calling them away from resources that they have. So if you're chewing a bone, I'm going to recall you and enforce a recall, and then I'll send you to a place board or something like that. And then I go pick up those items. It's a way that I can reduce conflict in that interaction And then it also gives me basically 2 steps that are early warnings if I'm going to potentially have an issue. So if my dog won't recall from that object, we're already defensive. If I go move to go pick that object up when my dog was on place, then that's my second thing that kind of, I have clear behavioral changes from my dog that tell me I'm about to have a problem, right? So if I'm trying to give people just easy, actionable advice to know whether or not they're maybe going to get bit by their dog over a resource, then these are ways that we can work on that. Obviously, I need to train that obedience and enforce those things, but I'm putting these extra things in place to make it so that I have time for whatever that arousal is in the dog to kind of bleed off, right? Other places where you can use this, in my experience, are when you're running your dog in the field. At a lot of NAVHDA tests, you will have water containers, right? Little mini kiddie pools, or like plastic barrels that have been cut in half, little dunk tanks that you can dunk your dog to just cool them off. And so what I would suggest that people do when they're running their dog is, if you feel like the wheels are falling off a little bit, you put your dog in that water and you leave them there until the judge tells you you have to take them out, right? So in those situations, you know, seconds can feel like minutes. And if your judges are going to give you a solid minute or two to let your dog kind of cool off, your dog is not only cooling off physically, your dog is cooling off mentally while they're hanging out in that tub of water in the field. So I would definitely use that to your advantage. The other place where I've had this come up with my dogs is in the heeling down to that steady by the blind sequence. Your dogs at some point know that that heeling down by the water is leading them to an exercise that requires a lot of obedience. But if they're getting very anticipatory and they're having trouble, then as long as you have good heeling, you can really slow down a lot and kind of make your dog stay and heel with you. I practice this all throughout my training. Our criteria for heeling in the hunt test is not very high. It's not a very high bar compared to a lot of other dog sports. But what I do help my dog understand is we're not moving closer to the launching point for any of this water work if you're not heeling correctly. So if I'm heeling with my dog and my dog scoots up ahead, I just stop. I use e-collar to draw my dog back, and then we'll walk a little bit more. My dog moves ahead. I stop. I use e-collar to pull my dog back. We habituate that enough that when I'm walking down to my steady by the blind sequence and my dog gets ahead, because I see she's really raring to go and she knows what comes next, I started walking like each step was 4 to 6 inches ahead of the other one, right? I'm not taking full strides, and that's forcing her to really kind of rein it in, and I'm able to kind of bleed off some of that intensity while we're walking. This happened at my utility test, the one where Anya got a max score. This was this past spring. I walked my dog funny down to the steady by the blind, and she's really herky-jerky in her movement. And the judge kind of came up to me and commented afterwards. He's like, I don't think your dog knew what you were doing there. And I don't think that he understood necessarily what I was trying to do there, which was just give my dog a little bit of time for some of that stuff to bleed off in a way that I had already communicated to her, and that I knew was going to work because we used it in training a lot. And again, that was in training. I always kind of showed her, like, we're not moving forward towards this skill until you're in the correct position. And so if we have to inch our way from the parking lot to the launching point for duck search or for steady by the blind, then that's what we do. I'm mentioning that because the better answer would be that you work your obedience in these places where your dog is used to doing really high drive activities enough that they can express what we would call neutrality in those environments. So in a perfect world, I would bring my dog out to that environment, heal them a bunch, and then just go home. And I would do that until they actually heal properly. And then maybe I go send them to do the, big duck search exercise that I spent a lot of time building a lot of drive for. The trouble is with those of us that play these hunt test games is we're driving very far sometimes to get to grounds where we can even engage in these exercises. So the idea that you would drive all the way there and just work on obedience and then go home is that's unpalatable to a lot of people. So I'm trying to give you a compromise solution to this drive capping issue that I was just talking about. But in a perfect world, you would do this. And you see this again in the bite sports a lot. is people will spend a lot of time practicing obedience in the presence of a decoy, the guy that's wearing that big kind of like pillowcase suit that the dog's going to eventually get to bite. They spend a lot of time creating a lot of intensity and desire to want to go bite that guy. And then they have to spend a lot of time teaching the dog, you're only allowed to do that when I tell you to, and the rest of the time I need you to ignore that guy. And I just culturally, in the way that we train and due to logistics, I think our people don't do that a lot. And so this is potentially maybe another way that you could mitigate some of those problems. That's my whole outline. So that's all the stuff that I wanted to talk to you guys about. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them. Don asked about how I'm providing room service during my training. So Don, in any place where, so what Don means by room service for people that don't train in our training system. So this term comes from a training system called NAVHDA that I, in the past couple of years, have gotten pretty involved with. And I just think it provides a really good mental model and framework for how you think about training your dog in every exercise and regardless of what sports you play or what breed your dog is. It's just a really good kind of general approach to training. Anyway, in that system, we have different ways we can reward the dog, and one of them is called room service. It's called that because we are bringing a reward to the dog, and the benefit of doing that is that if I'm doing stationary behaviors, then rewarding my dog while they are in that behavior tends to add stability to that behavior. They're not anticipating having to leave that position to go get a reward. They're assuming that someone's going to bring the reward to them, and that's why it creates stability. It kind of takes away that anticipation. The cost of that is that a lot of that anticipation is where what we call intensity or style comes from in our dogs. So if I do too much of this bringing rewards back to my dog, I potentially see loss of intensity. And there are places where I don't want that. So like in my pointing, for instance, in NAVHDA, my pointing needs to be I-cup, intense, convincing, unmistakable, and productive. Well, if my points look very soft, then maybe they're not intense and convincing. And so if I'm missing that criteria, maybe that impacts my score negatively. So just want to kind of talk about that first. The ways that we use those room service style rewards, I like to use them a lot in my field work. So I am often shooting birds in front of my dog that is standing there watching wing shot and fall. And then I'm bringing those birds back to my dog because I find that that removes a lot of the anticipation that leads to dogs breaking early. The other thing that I will do sometimes is, again, just trying to break up the pattern. Maybe I bring them a bird first, like I had a dead one already in my vest. And so I will hand that one to them, and then I will take it from them and then send them for a retrieve. It's just another way to try to add a pause in there so they're not expecting, as soon as that bird hits the ground, he's going to send me. Other places where I like to use this is any other place where there's stationary behavior supposed to happen. So steady by the blind is another one that's good. They can watch that bird fly through the winger, and then maybe I hand them a duck instead and just have them fetch that duck out of my hand. Or maybe I turn them away and I send them for a retrieve on land. So I'm just kind of trying to do something different and remove some of the draw from that marked retrieve there. So that's another time where you could play with some room service style rewards. I do most of that though in my steadiness process. So even in my yard work, when I'm just shooting a gun and teaching my dog through classical conditioning that shot means the same thing as whoa, right? So I just use that new signal, shoot the gun, and then I tell my dog whoa, and then over time shooting the gun, the dog thinks you're just going to say whoa right after that anyway, so I might as well just stop. And so to reward my dog for being responsive to that and stopping or standing still, then I will bring a bird back to them and usually pay them in place. And this could also be a bumper, or it could be a tug toy. I don't have any problems playing tug with my dogs. But I will bring it back to them so they get rewarded for standing still in place rather than getting rewarded by sending them for a retrieve. So I do that with steady to shot. I do that with steady to wing. And I do both of those things in the yard or in like the parking lot of our training areas first. I do them separately, and then I put them together still in the parking lot. Sometimes I do this on a place board. Sometimes I've done it on a whoa post. Your individual process for teaching this doesn't matter. The concept is bringing rewards back to your dog increases stability in the behavior that they were doing at that time. And so I like doing it there, and then I do move that stuff out in the field. So I have my dog running loose in the field. Maybe I hand throw a pigeon, or I have one in a launcher, and I pop that when they were not necessarily anywhere near it, but I just want them to see the visual of a bird flying, and I should see that they stop out of motion, even if they're in a full run because they're field searching. If they do that and stand still, I'm going to take the time to walk all the way to them, pull a bird out of my vest, and then give them a retrieve. But again, I'm like basically feeding that bird to the dog in that situation. I'm not feeding it to them, like actually letting them eat that. I just mean I'm hand delivering them that reward. And so I will do that in the field for steady to wing. I'll do that in the field for steady to shot. And then when we start adding gunners and all that other stuff back into the mix, I'll do it for all of that. So in our training system, I use pressure and reward for every repetition of every behavior until the dog shows me that they understand it, basically until they do it right. And then we start mixing up. Sometimes you don't get paid. Sometimes I don't use pressure to make you do it. We start varying those things after that point in time. But what I want is bird flying in the air means don't move. Shot means don't move. Gunners walking in front of you means don't move. When we start that, we have gunners walking in perpendicular. But as soon as my dog gets it, I want those gunners being able to walk right up behind my dog. Sometimes I'll ask people to run past my dog. Sometimes I will ask the gunners to, as they're walking past my dog, I want them to bump my dog with their knee. So I'll have them do all sorts of stuff to just proof that when people are walking in front of you, they're not trying to take your bird. You do need to stand still. That is a signal to just stand still. And then when the bird flushes, we already taught that, don't move. Bird gets shot, we already taught that, don't move. Bird hits the ground, the dog often wants to break, right? If I have a check cord on them, or I can tell them whoa, and they will stand still, and then I have the gunner go pick that bird up that just got shot and bring it back to the dog, then again, these people that I thought were challenging me for my bird, they're actually going to pick that bird up and they're bringing it back to me. So they're helping me get what I want. They're not challenging me for what I want, right? So we're just kind of trying to view these things from the dog's perspective. If I always think I have to run to go get the thing I want, then everything in my head is telling me I should run. If I think that I get what I want by just standing still, then I'm not going to be thinking about running. And then again, the cost of doing this is that you may see some of the intensity in your pointing go away. And so when that happens, now my job is to find the correct ratio, right? Out of every 5 or 10 point, flush, shot, fall sequences, how many of those do I need to send the dog for a retrieve, and how many do I need to bring the retrieve back to the dog in order to balance that out where I have the intensity that I want and I still am maintaining stability. So that's how I try to do a lot of that stuff. And again, we break up patterns. So sometimes I'm flushing 2 birds in a staggered flush. Anybody that's hunted sharktail early season, your dog maybe is running and they kind of blow through the first one. You see a bird go up. As long as you have stopped the flush, there's probably 5 more sitting right there, right? So if your dog will stop the flush there, then there will be more birds going up. So I like to teach my dog the first bird that goes up isn't the only bird that's going to go up. So we may pop 2 birds. We may pop 3 birds. We may pop 1 out of a launcher that the dog pointed, or we flush the one that's on the ground if it was just dizzied and kind of just set down there. And then that bird gets shot, and then maybe I got a bag full of birds and I throw another one. Gunners, empty your gun, shoot that bird. Then I throw another one. Gunners, empty your gun, shoot that bird. And we'll do 3, 4, 5 of those, and then I'll let my dog pick up all of them at the end. But we're just doing things to break up the pattern, because at your test, it's very likely going to be 1 point, 1 chucker gets up, 1 gunshot, 1 fall, 1 retrieve. And if it's always that order, that's why your dog breaks early, right? So we got to break up that pattern. We got to kind of get them feeling like sometimes the reward comes back to me. We have to help them understand people walking in front of them are not trying to take their reward from them. And if we do all of those things, then the steadiness stuff is usually pretty easy. It was the thing that I had the most trouble with when I was kind of learning and trying to figure this out. And then when I really started looking at it from the dog's perspective and using these different strategies for how the dog gets rewarded and breaking up the pattern, then a lot of that went very, very easy. So sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to your question. Does anybody else have any questions? All right. If not, then we'll go ahead and end this. I'll make a recording available for those of you that are in KLM GNA or your Potomac NAVHDA chapter. I'll share the recording of this in those groups. And then if you are not a member of either of those things, I will also post this. I have a page on I think it's coffee, ko-fi.com /Iron Oak Dogs. So all of these webinars have been recorded and they're posted there too for people that just kind of, you can be a member there, right? So just, I think it's like $3, $6, or $9. You can decide what you want to pay there per month. And then we post a lot of training content there. We're posting these webinars. And then the other thing that we're doing is a lot of videos with one of the puppies that we kept from the most recent litter. We're kind of posting a bunch of stuff every week of all the training that we're doing with that dog. We have the dogs being born, like the actual birthing of those puppies on video. And then we have been posting stuff at least weekly, and we'll continue to do that all the way through until they've passed at least all of their breed certifying tests, a little bit of the stuff that we're doing in hunting season, like we're heading to Montana in a couple weeks. And so little clips of all of that stuff is there just so people get an idea of our development process for puppies from literally the time they're born until they're through all of their training. So if you're interested in that, I think it's pretty cool stuff. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And I'll post this stuff in all those places I just said. Thank you.